The day he showed up at that gate begging to be let in was the day I realized some people only understand loss when it's too late. And even then they still don't understand it at all. Jason Miller stood outside a wrought iron gate that probably cost more than our entire old apartment, his dress shirt wrinkled, his voice raised just enough to draw attention but not enough to sound desperate, at least not to himself, and the security guard didn't even blink, just repeated calmly that his name wasn't on the list, that he didn't have authorization, that he needed to leave the property immediately, and I watched all of it from the second-floor window, fingers resting lightly on the glass, feeling nothing close to what I used to feel when I saw him, no fear, no hope, just a quiet distance that had taken me years to earn. And the strangest part was not seeing him there, but realizing how small he looked, how ordinary, how completely disconnected from the version of himself that once filled every corner of my life, the man who used to believe he had everything under control, the man who thought I had nowhere else to go, nowhere better to be. And if you had told him back then that one day he'd be standing outside my parents' house asking for a chance to talk, he would have laughed, probably made a joke about it over dinner, maybe even looked at me with that familiar half-smile that used to confuse kindness with ownership, because that's what he always believed, that I belonged to him, that my silence meant agreement, that my patience meant weakness, and for a long time I let him believe that, not because it was true, but because I didn't yet understand what it would take to walk away, not just physically but mentally, emotionally, completely. And the truth is, leaving doesn't happen in a single moment. It builds quietly like pressure behind a closed door, until one day the door doesn't open anymore, and you realize you've already stepped outside without even noticing when it happened. And Jason never saw that coming. He thought control was something permanent, something he could maintain as long as he set the rules, as long as I followed them, as long as nothing changed. But things were already changing long before I packed that single bag and left without saying goodbye, long before I turned off my phone and drove for hours without a destination in mind, long before I stood in front of this same gate, unsure if I even belonged here anymore. And now here he was on the other side, asking for entry into a world he never knew existed, a world I had kept hidden not out of shame but out of choice, because some parts of your life you protect until you're strong enough to stand in them again. And as I watched him argue with a man who had no idea who he was, I finally understood something that had taken me far too long to learn, that walking away wasn't the end of my story, it was the beginning of his unraveling, and the most powerful thing I could do now wasn't to confront him, wasn't to explain anything, it was simply to let him stand there, outside, exactly where he had placed me for so long, and for the first time, I didn't feel like the one who had lost anything at all. There was a time when I believed silence could fix everything, that if I stayed calm long enough, patient enough, careful enough with my words, things would eventually settle into something that felt like peace. But looking back now, I can see how slowly that belief shaped my entire life into something smaller than it was meant to be. Because the version of me that Jason knew was not the version I was born as, it was the version I became after months of adjusting, after years of choosing what not to say, what not to do, what not to expect. And it did not happen all at once, it never does. It started with small things like how he would make decisions without asking me and then say it was easier that way, how he would dismiss my opinions with a quick smile and a change of subject, how he would remind me casually that he was the one paying the bills, as if that meant something more than it actually did. And at first I told myself it was normal, that every relationship had its balance, that I just needed to adapt, but adaptation slowly turned into erasure. And I did not even notice when my voice started to sound unfamiliar to myself, when my days became predictable in a way that felt less like stability and more like being stuck. And the hardest part was not what he said or did, it was how convinced I became that this was all I deserved, that leaving would mean starting over with nothing, that I had already given too much of my time, my energy, my life to walk away now. And Jason understood that better than I did. He understood that as long as I believed I had no options I would stay, and he built his confidence on that belief. He spoke with certainty, moved with certainty, planned everything as if there was no version of the future where I was not standing right beside him, quietly agreeing, quietly supporting, quietly disappearing into the background of his life. And every time I thought about calling my parents, I stopped myself, not because I did not want to hear their voices, but because I did not want to explain why I had been gone for so long, why I had chosen a life that looked nothing like the one they had raised me for, because the truth was complicated and I did not have the words for it yet. I did not have the courage to admit that I had stayed in a place where I felt smaller every single day. And Jason never once questioned that silence. He never asked why I stopped sharing, why I stopped arguing, why I stopped trying, because to him everything was working exactly as it should. He saw control where I felt pressure, He saw loyalty where I felt distance, and that difference in perception was the quiet space where everything began to shift, because even though I did not speak it out loud, something inside me had already started to change, something that could not be reversed, something that made it harder to ignore the way I felt when I looked at myself in the mirror and did not recognize the person staring back. And it was not a dramatic moment, not a single event that pushed me to the edge. It was a slow accumulation of realizations, small thoughts that grew louder over time, until one day, sitting alone in the living room with the clock ticking too loudly against the walls, I understood something simple and undeniable: that staying was no longer the safer choice, that leaving was not about losing everything, it was about finally having a chance to find something again. And once that thought settled in, it did not go away, it stayed with me, followed me through every conversation, every quiet dinner, every moment where Jason spoke and I listened, until the idea of leaving stopped feeling impossible and started feeling necessary. And that was the moment everything truly began to change, even if he did not see it yet. Jason believed that stability came from control, and the more certain he became of that idea, the more confidently he built his world around it, a world where every decision had a clear hierarchy, where his voice carried final authority, where uncertainty was something to be eliminated rather than understood. And for a long time I fit into that structure in ways that made everything appear functional from the outside, because routine can look like happiness if no one questions it, and predictability can feel like safety if you have nothing else to compare it to. And Jason relied on that illusion more than anything. He relied on the idea that I would continue to follow the pattern we had created, that I would continue to wake up at the same time, prepare the same meals, respond with the same measured tone, and accept the same unspoken expectations that shaped every part of our daily lives. And he reinforced that belief in subtle ways, not through obvious demands but through consistency, through repetition, through small reminders that built a larger narrative over time, reminders that he was the one holding everything together, that his work, his income, his planning were the foundation of our life, and that my role existed somewhere within that framework, defined but not questioned. And the more he repeated that story, the more it began to feel like fact, even to me, even when something inside me started to resist it quietly, almost imperceptibly at first, like a thought that appears and disappears before you can fully examine it. But those thoughts began to stay longer, they began to connect, forming a clearer picture of what I had been ignoring. And Jason noticed the change in ways he could not quite explain. He would pause mid-sentence sometimes, looking at me as if expecting a different response, something more immediate, more compliant, and when it did not come, he would adjust his tone slightly, still calm, still controlled, but with an edge that suggested impatience, as if he could sense the shift without understanding its source. And instead of questioning it directly, he doubled down on what he knew, reinforcing the routines, tightening the structure, making sure everything remained exactly as it had always been, because from his perspective, change was a problem to be corrected, not a signal to be understood. And that was where the distance between us grew most clearly, not in what we said, but in what we no longer shared, because while he was trying to preserve the version of our life that worked for him, I was beginning to see that same version as something I could no longer stay inside. And the realization did not come with anger or sudden clarity, it came with a quiet certainty that settled deeper each day, a certainty that made it harder to participate in conversations that felt scripted, harder to respond in ways that felt expected rather than honest. And Jason interpreted that hesitation as distraction, as mood, as something temporary that would eventually pass, because in his experience everything always returned to normal, and normal to him meant control, it meant predictability, it meant me staying exactly where I was, and that belief allowed him to remain confident, even as the foundation beneath that confidence was slowly shifting, because what he did not see was that the more he tried to hold everything in place, the more I began to understand that I was not part of something stable, I was part of something that depended entirely on me not changing. And once I recognized that, once I understood that my silence was not maintaining peace but maintaining a version of reality that no longer fit who I was becoming, there was no way to unsee it, no way to return to the version of myself that accepted it without question. And from that point on, every day became less about whether I would leave and more about when, even if Jason still believed that nothing had changed at all. The night I left did not feel dramatic, there was no loud argument, no final words that marked the moment as something irreversible. It was quiet in a way that almost felt ordinary, and maybe that was what made it so different from everything Jason expected, because he believed that any real change would announce itself, that it would come with emotion he could respond to, something he could manage or redirect. But there was nothing for him to respond to that night, just the absence of the version of me he thought would always be there. And I remember standing in the bedroom, looking around at the space that had once felt like a shared life and realizing how little of it actually belonged to me. How every object seemed tied to a routine, a role, a version of myself that I had slowly outgrown without noticing the exact moment it happened. And I did not pack much, just a small suitcase with a few essentials, clothes that felt like mine rather than part of a routine, a couple of personal items that still carried a sense of identity I had not completely lost, and I moved carefully, not out of fear but out of clarity, because everything I did in that moment felt intentional, measured, final in a way that did not need to be announced to be real. And when I walked past the living room, the television was still on, casting a soft light across the walls, the kind of light that used to make evenings feel comfortable, predictable, but now it only highlighted how disconnected I had become from that version of life. And I paused for a second, not because I was unsure, but because I wanted to acknowledge the moment, to recognize that this was the point where everything shifted from thought into action. And then I picked up my keys, opened the door, and stepped outside without looking back. And the air felt different, not because anything had physically changed, but because for the first time in a long time, I was moving without asking myself how it would affect anyone else. And that feeling stayed with me as I got into the car, as I started the engine, as I pulled out onto the road with no clear plan except to keep going. And the drive itself was quiet, just the sound of the tires against the pavement, the steady rhythm of something moving forward without interruption. And I did not turn on the radio, I did not reach for my phone, I just let the silence exist because, for once, it did not feel like something I needed to fill. It felt like space, like room to think without being guided toward a conclusion. And somewhere along that drive, the question of where I was going stopped feeling uncertain and started feeling obvious, because even though I had avoided it for years, even though I had convinced myself that returning was not an option, there was only one place that represented something different from everything I was leaving behind. And the closer I got, the more I realized that the distance I had created was not just physical, it was emotional, built from assumptions about what it would mean to go back, what it would say about the choices I had made. And yet none of those assumptions mattered anymore, because the version of me who worried about those things was the same version who had stayed, who had adjusted, who had remained silent, and that version was no longer the one driving. And by the time I reached the long driveway I had not seen in years, lined with trees that looked exactly as I remembered and yet completely different at the same time, I understood that this was not about returning to the past. It was about stepping into a part of my life I had left untouched, a part that had always been there, waiting for the moment I was ready to face it again. And when I finally stopped the car and sat there for a second, looking at the house that felt both familiar and distant, I did not feel hesitation. I felt something much simpler and much stronger. I felt ready. The front door opened before I even had the chance to knock, as if someone had been watching, waiting, and for a brief second I wondered if anything had truly changed at all, if time had simply paused here while everything else in my life had moved forward without me. And my mother stood there, her expression calm but searching, taking in every detail without asking a single question, not about where I had been, not about why I was here. Just a quiet understanding that felt both unfamiliar and deeply comforting at the same time. And I realized then how long it had been since anyone looked at me without expectation, without assumption, just seeing me as I was in that moment. And she stepped aside without hesitation, giving me space to walk in, and the house felt exactly as I remembered it, not just in appearance but in atmosphere, steady, composed, untouched by the kind of tension I had grown used to. And that difference was almost overwhelming. Not because it was new, but because I had forgotten what it felt like to exist in a place where nothing needed to be carefully managed, where silence did not carry weight, where I did not have to anticipate how every small action might be interpreted. And I placed my suitcase down near the entrance, suddenly aware of how little I had brought with me compared to how much I had left behind. But for the first time, that imbalance did not feel like a loss, it felt like clarity, like I had finally separated what mattered from what never really did. And my father appeared moments later, not in a rush, not with urgency, just with the same composed presence that had always defined him. And when he looked at me, there was no surprise, no disappointment, just recognition, as if he had always known that this moment would come eventually, even if I had not. And he did not ask for explanations either, did not question the choices I had made or the time that had passed. He simply acknowledged my presence with a quiet nod that carried more acceptance than any conversation could have. And that was when it became clear to me that returning here was not about seeking permission or validation. It was about stepping back into a part of my life that had never required me to prove anything in the first place. And as I followed them further inside, past familiar rooms that seemed unchanged yet felt entirely different through the lens of who I had become, I began to understand something that I had not allowed myself to consider before, that I had not left this place because it was lacking. I had left because I thought I needed to find something on my own, something separate, something that would define me independently, and in doing so I had convinced myself that coming back would mean failure, that it would mean admitting that I had made the wrong choices, but standing there now, surrounded by a sense of stability that did not need to be earned or negotiated, I realized how incomplete that understanding had been, because returning was not about undoing the past, it was about recognizing that strength does not always come from enduring, sometimes it comes from choosing where you no longer belong, and my mother gestured toward the staircase, telling me that my room was exactly as I had left it, as if no time had passed at all, and I paused for a moment, taking in the simplicity of that statement, the quiet assurance that some things do not disappear just because you step away from them, and as I picked up my suitcase again and made my way upstairs, each step felt lighter than the last, not because the journey had been easy, but because for the first time in a long time, I was not carrying the weight of expectations that were never truly mine to begin with, and as I reached the top of the stairs and opened the door to a space that still held pieces of who I used to be, I understood that this was not the end of anything. It was the beginning of finally seeing my life for what it could be without limits that I had once accepted as permanent. The first morning in that house did not feel like a return. It felt like waking up in a version of life that had been paused and was now continuing without needing explanation. And as sunlight moved slowly across the floor of my old room, I noticed how different everything felt when there was no pressure attached to it, no expectation shaping how I should begin the day, no voice in the background defining what was necessary or acceptable. And for a few moments I simply stayed there, not out of hesitation but out of awareness, recognizing how unfamiliar it had become to exist in a space where I did not need to anticipate anything, and that awareness carried with me as I walked downstairs, where the house was already quietly active in a way that felt structured but not restrictive, and my mother was in the kitchen, not rushing, not managing, just moving through her routine with a calm precision that came from choice rather than obligation. And she greeted me the same way she always had, as if nothing needed to be adjusted or redefined, offering breakfast without asking questions, creating space without demanding answers, and I realized that this kind of normal was something I had slowly forgotten, not because it disappeared, but because I had replaced it with something that required constant adjustment, constant awareness, constant effort to maintain, and here none of that effort was necessary, and as I sat at the table the silence did not feel heavy, it felt neutral, open, like something that allowed thought rather than restricted it, and that was when my father joined us, placing a folded newspaper on the table, his presence steady as always, and he looked at me briefly before speaking, not about the past, not about why I was here, but about something entirely different, asking if I planned to stay for a while, not as a question that required justification, but as a simple acknowledgement of the present, and I answered without overthinking, without filtering, saying yes because for the first time that answer did not feel complicated, it did not carry layers of meaning or consequence, it was just true, and he nodded once as if that was all that needed to be said, and then continued as if the conversation had naturally moved forward, mentioning that there were things I might want to take care of while I was here, practical matters, not instructions, not expectations, just options, and it was in that moment that I began to understand something more clearly, that the life I had stepped back into was not defined by control, it was defined by access, by the ability to choose, to move, to decide without needing permission, and that realization did not come with excitement or overwhelming emotion, it came with a quiet sense of alignment, as if something that had been slightly off for a long time was finally settling into place, and throughout the day, that feeling continued to build, not through anything dramatic but through small observations, the way conversations flowed without tension, the way time passed without being measured against expectations, the way I could move through the house without feeling like I needed to justify my presence, and at some point I found myself standing near the large windows in the study, looking out over the grounds that stretched farther than I could see clearly, and I remembered how I used to think of this place as distant, almost detached from the kind of life I wanted to create, and now I could see how incomplete that perspective had been, because what I had left behind was not restriction, it was foundation, something I had not fully understood until I experienced what it felt like to live without it. And as I stood there, taking in the quiet consistency of everything around me, I realized that the shift I had been feeling was not just about where I was, it was about who I was becoming in this space, someone who no longer needed to shrink to fit into a structure that was never meant for her, someone who could exist fully without negotiating her value. And that understanding did not need to be announced, it did not need to be explained, it simply existed steady and certain, shaping everything that would come next, even if the rest of the world had not yet caught up to it. Jason did not realize anything had truly changed at first because from his perspective, my absence fit into a pattern he believed he understood, a temporary reaction, something that would eventually resolve itself the way it always had before, and in the days after I left, he moved through his routine with the same confidence, expecting that I would return once the distance felt inconvenient, once the silence became uncomfortable, once reality set in the way he assumed it would, and he told himself a story that made everything make sense, that I needed time, that I would come back, that nothing fundamental had shifted, and that belief allowed him to remain calm, even slightly amused, as if the situation was something he could simply wait out, and when a few days passed without any message, without any call, he adjusted his expectations slightly but not his conclusion, telling himself that I was being stubborn, that I was trying to prove a point, that eventually I would reach out, because I had no real alternative, and that assumption shaped everything he did next because instead of questioning what had changed, he focused on maintaining the version of reality he believed in, continuing his work, continuing his routines, speaking about me to others in a way that minimized the situation, presenting it as a minor disagreement rather than something significant. And people around him accepted that explanation because it aligned with what they already saw: a stable life, a predictable structure, nothing that suggested something deeper had been disrupted. And for a while that narrative held because nothing immediately contradicted it, but then small things began to shift in ways he could not easily explain, not dramatic changes, not obvious disruptions, just subtle inconsistencies that did not fit into the story he had created, a delayed response from a colleague who was usually immediate, a meeting that was unexpectedly rescheduled without a clear reason, a tone in certain conversations that felt slightly more distant than before. And at first he dismissed these things as coincidences, as normal fluctuations that did not require attention, but as they continued they became harder to ignore, because they did not follow a pattern he recognized, they did not respond to the usual ways he managed problems, and that lack of control, even in small details, began to create a sense of unease that he was not used to experiencing, and, instead of addressing it directly, he redirected his focus, convincing himself that the real issue was still my absence, that once I returned everything would settle back into place, that whatever felt off would correct itself naturally, and with that belief, he decided to reach out, not out of concern, not out of reflection, but out of expectation, sending a message that was brief and direct, asking when I planned to come back, as if the answer was already understood, as if the only variable was timing. And when no response came, not immediately, not hours later, not even the next day, that was when the first real crack appeared in the certainty he had built, because silence, when it does not follow the expected pattern, becomes something else entirely. It becomes a question that cannot be easily answered. And for the first time Jason was faced with something he could not define, not because it was complicated, but because it did not fit into the structure he had always relied on. And that was the beginning of a shift he had not prepared for. A shift that would not be resolved by waiting, by assuming, or by maintaining control, even if he had not yet realized how much of that control had already disappeared. By the time Jason realized that waiting was not going to bring things back to normal, the pattern he relied on had already broken in ways he could no longer ignore, and what unsettled him most was not a single major event, but the accumulation of small, quiet disruptions that did not respond to his usual methods of control, because control to him had always been about predictability, about understanding how things would react when he applied pressure or direction, and now nothing was reacting the way it was supposed to. Conversations that used to follow a clear path now ended abruptly, people who once responded with immediate agreement now hesitated, and opportunities that once seemed certain began to feel uncertain without any obvious explanation. And at first he tried to correct it in the only way he knew, by asserting more confidence, by speaking more firmly, by reinforcing his position as if the structure would stabilize if he pushed hard enough. But the more he did that, the more he noticed something subtle but undeniable, that the responses he received were no longer aligned with his expectations, not openly resistant, not confrontational, just slightly distant, slightly less engaged, as if something had shifted beneath the surface that no one was addressing directly. And that was when he started looking for a cause, not in himself, but in external factors, reviewing recent decisions, reconsidering conversations, searching for a moment where something might have gone wrong. But every time he thought he had found it, the explanation did not fully hold because the changes were not tied to a single point. They were spread out, interconnected in a way that suggested something larger, something systemic rather than situational. And that realization made him increasingly uncomfortable, because it meant he was dealing with something he could not isolate or fix quickly. And in that discomfort, his thoughts returned to me not with clarity, but with a growing sense that my absence was connected to everything else, not logically, not in a way he could explain, but intuitively, as if the timing itself carried meaning. And for the first time, he began to question an assumption he had held from the beginning, that I would come back, because the longer the silence continued, the more that assumption lost its foundation, and without that certainty, he was left with something unfamiliar, the possibility that the situation was not temporary, that it was not part of a cycle that would reset, but a shift that would continue moving forward without him being able to influence it. And that possibility pushed him into action, not out of understanding but out of urgency, because uncertainty, when it reaches a certain point, becomes something that demands a response. And so he tried calling, not once but multiple times, expecting that persistence would eventually lead to an answer. And when that failed, he sent messages that were longer, more detailed, shifting in tone from casual to direct, from confident to slightly strained, still controlled, still measured, but carrying an edge that had not been there before. And when those messages also went unanswered, the situation became something he could no longer frame as a simple disagreement or temporary distance. It became something else entirely, something that did not fit into any pattern he recognized. And that was when the structure he had built his confidence on began to collapse internally, not visibly, not in a way others could immediately see, but in a way that changed how he perceived everything around him, because once control is no longer reliable, every assumption built on it starts to weaken. And for the first time, Jason was not just dealing with a problem, he was facing a reality he did not understand, one where his expectations no longer shaped the outcome, one where silence was not something that would eventually break in his favor, but something that might continue indefinitely. And that realization, quiet and unresolved, was far more destabilizing than anything he had experienced before. Jason sat alone in his office, his thoughts swirling in ways they had never done before, because this silence, this growing distance, was different from anything he had faced in the past, and no amount of persistence, no number of messages, no number of calls was going to bring back the version of reality he had counted on. For the first time in a long time, he did not have a clear way forward. He had always been able to navigate through challenges, always believed that he could bend things to his will with enough effort, but this was different. This was a shift that did not respond to his influence, and it was making him question not just the situation with me but everything else, the assumptions he had built his life on. He had never considered that silence could carry its own meaning, that absence could speak louder than words, and that realization was unsettling, because if the silence was not a temporary break, if it was not just a phase, then what did it mean? What was left of the world he had carefully constructed, the one where everything fell into place according to his expectations? And so he found himself in a place he had never imagined, not just uncertain about the future, but questioning everything he thought he knew about control, about relationships, about the roles he had assigned to others and to himself. He had always been confident in his ability to manage, to direct, to keep things in line, but now, with me still absent, with the situation not resolving itself as he had expected, he began to wonder if the world he had lived in for so long was not as solid as he had once believed. The longer I stayed away, the more his confidence wavered, and the more he realized that there were no easy solutions, no quick fixes, no amount of willpower that could restore the balance he had once taken for granted. What disturbed him the most was the nagging feeling that he had never truly understood me, that all the time we had spent together, all the years, had been shaped by his own narrative, not mine, and that he had failed to see the cracks in that story until now. And the more he tried to piece things back together, the more the pieces seemed to slip through his fingers, because for the first time, he was not in control, and that loss of control left him in a place he could not navigate, and it unsettled him in ways that he could not fully articulate. But the more he tried to hold on to the things he thought he knew, the more it became clear that something had shifted beyond his reach. And the more he thought about it, the more he realized that the absence of one person, the absence of me, had shifted everything, had changed the landscape of his life in a way he was not prepared for. And the longer it continued, the more it became clear that the life he had built was fragile in ways he had never considered, because nothing is as permanent as we think, and the deeper he dug into the situation, the more he saw that the patterns he had relied on had already fractured, and there was no easy way to put them back together, no way to restore the balance that had once felt so solid, because everything that had seemed stable was now uncertain, and that was a truth he had never prepared himself for, a truth that made him question everything, and for the first time, Jason realized that the distance between us was not something that could be closed by trying harder, by pushing more, by expecting things to fall back into place because things had changed, and they were not going to change back.